Hello, I'm Poppy Frater, Sheep and Grassland Specialist with SAC Consulting. I'm here today to talk about weed control at Grassland. So I'm joined here today by Colin Taylor of Taylor Technologies, and we will hear in a bit about his innovations to sustainably control weeds such as docks and thistles. But to set the scene, I just wanted to talk about how these weeds can have an impact on farm grassland productivity. Grassland weeds reduce the productivity in a field in a number of ways, and they reduce the ability of grasses such as ryegrass and clover, which we typically want in a field, to survive and grow well by outcompeting them. As a general rule, if there are 10% docks in a field, the grassland optimum yield is reduced by 10%. So that can impact the productivity of the field in a number of ways. You may not achieve the stocking rate that's possible. Your silage yield may be lower than optimum. You may need to buy in additional ground over winter, for instance. And your silage quality would be suboptimal too. So it's important to gauge the level of weeds such as docks and creeping thistles to understand whether they're impacting your business profitability and understand what to do next. So for starters, review the level of weed infestation in the field to understand whether weed control would be economical. Assess half-metre by half-metre squares around various locations around the field, and if more than 10% of that square has weeds, then production is being compromised. So as a first point of call, it's worthwhile checking the soil fertility and soil health generally and the grazing management of a field, because by getting these aspects right, we aim to favour the species such as ryegrass and clover. We're creating an environment where these species thrive so they can outcompete the weed species. Docks do like high fertile soils. They actually like soils quite high in potassium. And that's why we often see them around slurry stores and manure heaps. Their seeds also survive through the intestinal tract of the animal. So slurry and manure can actually be a source of dock seeds onto the field. So this puts an importance of controlling the docks around these manure stores, particularly if it's going to be spread onto grass fields. Dock seeds can remain dormant in the soil for up to 80 years. The plant actually can tolerate shading, and they can even flower after cutting. So this sort of gives an understanding of why we need to control that plant before it seeds in the first place. Another important weed in Scotland grassland is creeping thistle. Again, the creeping thistle can remain dormant in the soil for up to 20 years. They seed not just through flowering, but they also reproduce just through tiny fragments in their roots can reproduce. And often there's a lot more of the thistle below the ground than there is above the ground. So it's a really tricky weed to control. Creeping thistles are important not only because they reduce grass yield, so it only takes 2 shoots within a metre squared to reduce grass yield by 15%, but also affects the grass utilisation. Stock don't like grazing around thistles. Plus, you've got animals like lambs that are more susceptible to orth if they're grazing around thistles as well. So they're important in that regard too. So I'm joined here today by Colin Taylor of Taylor Technologies. And Colin has developed some new innovation which can help us be more targeted with our weed control. So Colin, can you talk us through what you've developed here and how it helps in the challenges of weed control in Scotland?
Sure. So we've developed a technology system that is fitted to conventional crop sprayers, and in doing so automates the detection and spot spraying of grassland weeds. So docks, thistle, ragwort, the main broadleaf weeds that have a rosette shape, big leaved weeds, our system identifies them and sprays them. Only the weeds and not the grass or the clover.
Great. So you mentioned the importance of being targeted to the weeds and not the grass and the clover. A lot of the sprays on the market, in fact very few, are clover safe sprays. So that enables us to use these more broad spectrum sprays but still be targeted to the weeds.
Sure. So like you say, there's very few that are actually clover safe. If you get the right conditions for the weeds, then the right conditions can also be effective in harming the clover even more if the spray gets onto them. So we are specifically identifying weeds and identifying the clover in order to avoid the clover and only hit the weeds.
Great. So how does the technology work?
So the technology is made up of several components. There's cameras, computers, artificial intelligence software, and the nozzle valves. So the cameras are mounted on the boom, in front of the boom. So as you're going across the field, the cameras view an area of the ground and the grass, and they take tens of images a second and feed it back to the computers. The computers pass the images to the software. So the artificial intelligence software has been trained to look for targets, specific targets. It's been trained with millions of images in the training process. So it has an understanding as an artificial intelligence software of what it's looking for, and it can look for those targets in the images it's fed. So it's looking for the weeds as a target, and it's also looking for clover as a target. So if it finds the weeds, it knows that it needs to spray and action the specific valves to spray the weed and only the weed. So if camera 1 passes the images over and it finds a dock in that image, it's going to only turn the nozzle valves on for camera 1, and it's not going to have any of the other valves on if there's no docks in the image. So that's one target, that's a weed target. If there's a clover target found, it actions the mapping system to record the location of the clover. So we record the location of the clover, but we also record the location of the spot sprays as well. So basically, the system looks for its targets, and whenever it finds a target, if it's a weed, it sprays and maps the location, and if it finds a clover target, it maps the location. So the sprayer goes into the field. There's no difference in the chemical dilution or the rate that we apply. We're still diluting the chemical at the label rate. And a way to think of it is if you filled the sprayer up and drove at the speed that we're driving at, you would apply the chemical at the full label rate on the field. What we're doing is just turning off the valves and only turning them on when it's needed. So, and we're also producing the maps of what it sees and does in the field.
So you must be saving farmers a bit of money compared to more general spraying.
We are, yeah. So the data this year from our contracting service suggests that the average saving, the average reduction in chemical application is 65%. Now, that's an average, so obviously there's a lot above that and there's some below that. So generally that's saving farmers £30 to £40 per hectare at the average, and it can be even more in some cases. Because you look at a field and there's areas of the field that don't have weeds. So you look at the farm overall, and the average for the farm, all farms are making a saving with our service.
Great. So what are you finding as to the average level of dock infestation, and how is that changing as a result of what you're doing?
So with the average levels of dock populations, what we're saying is that the reduction in the herbicide that we're applying equals the population of docks. So if we go to a farm and we spray 85% less chemical, there's 15% population of docks over the area we've sprayed. So there's 15% ground cover of docks. You could say that then that there's an increase in the grass yield by that amount, or give or take that amount depending on the conditions. So with the maps we're seeing, we've not done enough seasons with the maps to see the decline. This year's the first season with the mapping. So what we will look for is the areas where there was bad dock infestations that we've sprayed. We'll look for in the maps in the future coming years reduced intensity of those populations. And hopefully we'll also see with the clover that we're mapping an increase in the population of clover as well.
Great. And could you talk us through, in terms of getting the most effective control of weeds, when would be the best time to spray them?
So I think the SAC guidance for spraying docks is the after first cut, before second cut, or growthy conditions really. Good times of the year when it's warm enough that the docks are growing quite rapidly, and therefore there's a lot of new leaf material and to take up the chemicals. So we generally are spraying throughout the year. We're actually spraying before first cut as well. We find that there's conditions before first cut that are favourable for good kill of the docks, and it enables farmers to get an even bigger first cut as well if you're getting rid of the docks, where would normally be you'd be killing the clover and stunting the grass, you wouldn't be getting as big a yield. So we find that there's various times throughout the year that we'll go and spray, and we're coming into the favourable time of the year at the moment where good conditions, although apart from today with the rain and the wind, but generally fast growing conditions for the docks, and they're all roughly at the same size after a cut of silage. They're all sort of growing at the same stage, so you get them all when they're at the right maturity. And so that's seasonal, and if you look at it on the day, you want to be getting in with a good water volume and an adjuvant preferably, in good conditions. We generally run with a sort of a low drift nozzle because we work in a range of conditions, and some of the gusts of wind can be higher in the field than the average of what you go out to spray in. So to account for those worst case conditions, we have a coarser nozzle, but for even better coverage. And we've never had a problem with any of the kill with that coarse nozzle, but for even better coverage, you would probably want a finer nozzle as well. So adjuvant, good conditions, the chemical being applied at the right stage to a rapidly growing dock. I think generally that size or bigger is considered a good stage for killing them.
Great, thank you. And we've talked a lot about docks, but what about creeping thistles in terms of growth stage and effective control?
So as far as I'm aware, the requirements are still the same of a rapidly growing plant in the good conditions. Our technology can identify the broadleaf weeds, so the rosette type weeds of that kind of shape and size. It can identify them all at the right conditions. So although we work mainly on docks because they're the real kind of scourge of the dairy farms in the area that we're working in, we do encounter thistles, and getting the coverage is quite important on them. I think the leaves are quite difficult to get a good cling of the chemical onto, so you really want the right conditions for them, and preferably an adjuvant as well.
Okay, good. And then in terms of environmental protection, we've got to be we've got to be careful when spraying such chemicals that we are not impacting our watercourses. So is there anything you do in order to help protect the environment in that regard?
Sure. So in the first instance, actually using the technology, we'd say is benefiting the environment because you're applying so much less chemical. If we're applying on average, a 65% less chemical, but in most cases it could be much higher than that. So we're already doing that where there's less chemical to pollute the environment because there's less being applied. So overall, that would be the answer for the technology. But on the day, again, it's your watercourse boundaries and such, like your buffer zones that you're observing as well. So follow the label, and that's generally the advice that's given, and that's what we follow.
And what about in terms of preventing the plant go to seed? How do you manage that?
Well, from our perspective, we'd say long-term, use the chemicals in the right way at the right time to reduce the burden of weeds and reduce the chance of the weeds getting to seed. I suppose the cultural controls would be to observe where your weeds are in fields that can't be sprayed and use other methods of control to control them. So if you've got a field where you can't get the sprayer to it and your docks are likely going to seed there, unfortunately, you might need to go out with a knapsack or strimmer or other methods, depending on the size of the area. So, again, we would always recommend a long-term approach. Chemicals, not a bad thing, used in the right way, in the right conditions, in the right manner. And we think that is that you're not using it over grass and clover. So long-term, you're getting the benefits there.
So prevention is always better than the cure. So avoiding poaching in areas of bare ground where these weeds can take hold. And as Colin mentioned, making sure the soil fertility and the soil structure and soil health generally is good to give the grass and the clover that competitive advantage. If you've got gappy swards, looking to overseed those swards to get in there before those weeds can make use of that opportunity. Avoid grazing or cutting too low, because if you think if that grass is grazed too short, it's going to be slower to recover, and that will give those weeds that greater opportunity again. So Colin's mentioned quite nicely the need to use chemical control before the plant goes to seed to prevent that seed production. Some people may not be able to use chemical control for being organic or for other reasons. And in that case, topping before flowering can have the benefits of preventing that seed production. There are a few, albeit a limited number, of clover safe sprays on the market. And as you can see in the photos presented, this is a trial involving Squire Ultra, which is a clover safe spray, which has successfully killed off the docks without impacting the clover in this silage field. So if you don't have the option to use targeted methods, such as the spray I presented today, using clover safe sprays might be another option. Of course, there's another method to target the weeds and try and reduce impact on the grass and clover, and that is using methods such as a weed wiper. These can be effective as well, but they would be a bit slower than technology as presented today by Colin, and there might be that bit of spray back onto the grass as well. But again, if the other alternatives aren't available, a weed wiper can be effective. Thank you for watching. For more information, please see our grassland management resources on the Farm Advisory Service webpage. Thank you to Colin Taylor of Taylor Technologies.